So how are we doing in here? We are going to have an exam next week, yes? That exam will be Wednesday of next week. We'll cover development, motivation and emotion, and perception. We will finish development today and even start the next section.
What did you say the topics were?
Development, motivation and emotion, and perception. Okay? That is where we are. We're going to finish development. We left off talking about Kohlberg and so we were looking at Kohlberg last time, remember? That is where we left off. And Kohlberg develops 3 levels. Each level has 2 stages, so there are 6 stages in all. And Kohlberg was looking at moral reasoning in particular. That's what that little scenario is about. And what he does is he actually developed a whole series of these things. And he asks individuals to look at them to say whether the action is good or bad, right or wrong, and to describe why. And he's looking at the type of reasoning system involved. And basically these levels, we'll just deal with the levels. You don't have to memorize the stages. I do want you to know that Kohlberg identifies 3 levels. There are 3 levels and 6 stages. You don't have to memorize them. You should know what the levels are: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And they refer to different modes of reasoning. So in the pre-conventional level, can we say what type of reasoning that is? I mean, he's looking at the type of reasoning an individual utilizes and the outcome, what the individual thinks about good or bad, right or wrong. So he's looking at the difference between things like concrete reasoning as opposed to abstract reasoning. So if we look at the first one, like pre-conventional, if we're looking at a reasoning system that is based on punishment, so fear-based reasoning, or reasoning system that's based on whether the individual gets something from the situation, some sort of self-gain. That's pre-conventional. Doesn't look at the merits, right? Looks at whether, right? Whether the risk factor, right? What if I get caught? What if this? What if? Conventional thinking, right? The individual is very much concerned about how a particular action might appear to his peers or contemporaries. What will people think of me? And the post-conventional type of reasoning that Kohlberg identified is where individuals can look at the situation, evaluate the situation, pull it apart, and make a determination based on what the situation presents, whether an action is just or unjust, right or wrong, right? Justifiable or not. So Kohlberg's question is, in the reasoning system of the individual, is there an inherent connection between the way someone thinks and what the likely outcome of their reasoning will be in terms of morality? So what does he think? If we look at the first one, pre-conventional, what type of reasoning system would you say that this is? Concrete thinking or abstract thinking? Concrete. Why concrete?
Because you can't really regular problem much, it's kind of clear cut.
It's clear cut, right? An action is inherently, right? The person says, look, I'm not going to do this unless I get something out of it. It's very self-focused, only focused on self-gain, not the merits of the situation. Right? This act is inherently, right, wrong. So what if I get caught? I'm the one who's going to go to jail. I'm the one who's going to be punished as a result. Right? So it's not an assessment of the situation per se and what the situation presents. Conventional reasoning, while here Kohlberg thinks that there is greater awareness of what's involved or what's at stake, the individual is not going to do anything that may make him or her appear adversely, right, in the minds of others. So, what if I get caught? What will people think of me? And then what he calls post-conventional is where the individual looks at the situation, can reflect on the situation, and is going to make the most independent type of judgment based on what is presented in the situation. Kohlberg, based on his research, believes that there is a relationship between the ability to think abstractly and the ability to think morally. He thinks they go together. That's basically what he thinks. That's what he thinks. He thinks that if we have people who are highly concrete thinkers, that's what pre-conventional thinking is. That they can only see situations in particular ways, that they don't have the intellectual or abstract flexibility to pull something apart, weigh out the merits. Highly concrete thinkers are very literal thinkers. It's either good or bad, right or wrong, black or white, right? They're very concrete, they're very literal. And he thinks that that represents the lowest, right, form of moral reasoning. But the moral reasoning ability is limited, Kohlberg maintains, because of the inherent inability for abstract thinking and reasoning. So someone who's a concrete thinker, right, tends to see either good or bad. Doesn't have the capacity to weigh the possibilities between what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, about all of the things that may intervene between the two extremes, which Kohlberg maintains goes with abstract thinking and reasoning. So what Kohlberg is really looking at, remember, Kohlberg was a student of Piaget. He was one of Piaget's students. So he picks up on the concept of abstract thinking and reasoning. And he wants to look at how abstract thinking and reasoning might play out in life. What does it do for individuals or not do for individuals? That's what he's looking at. So by the way, what do you think? Kohlberg maintains, based on his research, that these things are connected. The ability to think abstractly and the ability to think morally. What do you think? Think that's true?
Yeah.
No,
Why not?
because if that were the case, then people who only have concrete thinking would not be able to distinguish between right versus wrong. That
They-
is their set of morals.
They might be able to distinguish between right and wrong. But the reasons, can they think about the possibilities between a yes or a no, a good or a bad, a right or a wrong?
I'm not sure what the gray area has to do with whether someone has morals or not, though.
Because there can be many shades of possibilities between an inherently good act and an inherently wrong act.
Yeah.
Like the example you gave us about the person who needs the pill, but the doctor's charging
Yes,
double what it's worth.
yes, yes. So in that example we looked at, that's one of the scenarios.
I understand that, but I don't agree that somebody who has concrete thinking isn't necessarily coming from a moral perspective.
Morally, though, wouldn't the doctor be coming from a concrete perspective, saying, "This is what I'm charging you, steal, that's wrong, I don't care if your wife dies"?
But
That's concrete thinking, that's not morally correct.
Who says it's not morally
I
correct?
say it's not
Well,
morally correct,
you
and when
see-
normal public say it's not
Yeah,
morally
you see,
correct.
the thing is, from a Kohlbergian, and the interesting thing about Kohlberg is, Kohlberg grounds this in their, philosophically, what is a just decision? There are things in philosophy that talk about justice, all right? What is justice, what is fairness, what is equity, right? We're not gonna go into them. I was talking to our philosophy professor about this and going over some stuff about Kohlberg with him. Because Kohlberg doesn't just invent this. Kohlberg grounds this in a very distinct Western philosophical tradition about what is an inherently good act. What makes an act good? Right? So, Kohlberg is trying to look at the relationship between the two. So let me take an example. Right? And then we got to leave this. I just want to point this out to you, because I think it's kind of interesting to look at. It's an interesting question. Kohlberg is not without its controversy. So, what would be another example of concrete thinking? Right? If we look at religious fundamentalism, a fundamentalist or very literal interpretation of the Bible, is that abstract thinking or concrete thinking? It's concrete thinking. What is inherently good or bad, right or wrong, is based on what? What the Bible says? Does the individual have the capacity to go outside what is written or what is presented? You see, Kohlberg's position is the capacity to go outside what is presented in order to determine the ultimate rightness of an act has to be grounded in abstract reasoning. Right? An individual who blindly accepts or accepts only what is written is a highly concrete, literal thinker, and can only judge what's good or bad, right or wrong, only based on what he or she is given. They don't, right? Those are concrete thinkers. Do they have the capacity to go beyond what they are immediately given? That's the point Kohlberg's making. Now, again, he is not without controversy. Some controversy is identified in the reading. Along comes a female psychologist. Her name is Carol Gilligan. Right? And Carol Gilligan was one of Kohlberg's critics. Gilligan comes along, and what do you think Gilligan says? She makes this argument, not me. It's a good thing it came from a female. She says women don't think this way. She says the type of reasoning system that Kohlberg identifies is predicated on male thinking, that men tend to reason this way. How do women reason? This is what she says.
There are factors.
Well, what types of factors?
Well, they talk about the porcupine and the moles, and instead of choice A or choice B that they're given, she says, well, how about choice C? Let's put a blanket over them. Why does they have to leave or stay? Go with an independent option.
Yeah. See, Kohlberg comes along because people would say, well, you know, could this be? Kohlberg says, look, answer the question only in terms of what is given. You know, don't put other things into it. So Gilligan says that's unfair to women because women are going to come from a more emotional or compassionate perspective, and they're going to look for some other, right? So she became one of Kohlberg's most ardent critics. But when we look at the research tends to uphold which one? Ours or his? His. Upholds Kohlberg's. The subsequent research that comes along. Kohlberg died at a very young age. He had a degenerative neurological disease. But it's, you know, it's a very interesting position. And he's not around anymore to defend himself or to talk about this, but other people have picked this up. Is there a connection between the way an individual comes to think and reason about the world and ultimately how they decide on what is inherently right or wrong? And I'll tell you, he looks at a lot of stuff. He looks at the Nuremberg trials. Right? Everyone knows what those are, yes? After World War II, crimes against humanity. He looks at conscientious objectors in the military and the way in which they reason about their position, you know, how they can pull themselves out of a situation and look at what is inherently right or wrong, good or bad. Not what they're being told what is inherently right or wrong, good or bad. He pulls these things apart. And again, it's not without its controversy, but it's one of the ways in which the concept of abstract thinking has been looked at.
Test is next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, Wednesday of next week, because we will finish development today, start motivation and emotion, finish motivation and emotion on Wednesday. Easy. It's pretty straightforward. And begin perception probably toward the end of Wednesday's class, and then finish perception on Monday. And so that will put us in great shape, okay, for this upcoming exam. And the exam is exactly the same format as the first one, 50 multiple choice questions.
Is the brain stuff?
No. Only brain development, not the other stuff on the brain. And only brain development. The material that's in the section on development, which begins with brain development. We talked about stimulation and the importance of stimulation and neuronal growth, and the last part of the brain to develop is the frontal region of the brain. That stuff will be on this exam. Okay? Erickson. Tell me who Erickson was. What does he do? he's got, how many? 8. He's got what he calls 8 psychosocial stages that begin at birth and go all the way to old age and death. So they span the entire life cycle. Now, Erickson dies in 1994. He was born in like 1903, died in 1994. Why do we still talk about him? Well, for the same reasons we talk about people like Piaget, and ultimately we'll talk about Freud, because his impact has been enormous. Erickson was a clinician, and he worked with people of all ages. He's a developmental psychologist. So he looks at stages, he identifies stages, and he identifies critical issues in the various stages. As a clinician, Erickson was especially talented when it came to working with children and adolescents. He did things that were really pretty incredible. And when someone is that talented and that insightful, right, you look at what they have to say. And that is part of Erickson's legacy. Similar to like people like Piaget, I mean, he's got a lasting impact on education. Doesn't matter whether you like him or you don't like him, his impact is what we have to understand. Now, Erickson, right, he starts out really as Freudian, but he moves from the Freudian position. He's not a strict Freudian. We haven't spoken about Freud. One of the things that separates Erickson from Freud, Freud was highly deterministic, and you don't have to memorize these stages. Okay? You just have to know who Erickson was because of his impact, and a few things about him, and about what he says. For Freud, things are highly deterministic. Childhood determines everything about adult personality. Right? One of Freud's primary contributions to psychology is, in fact, the importance of childhood, and childhood is important. And everybody who's influenced by Freud thinks that, believes that, and it is. But Erickson, while he takes that in and says, yes, childhood is important, he does give credence to the notion that people can change or continue to grow after childhood. Right? That's something that Freud does not do. Freud thinks that the early years determine everything. Right? For Erickson, they're important, right? And they could, if there's some overwhelming circumstance in the early years, but the early years don't necessarily determine everything that happens. So when we look at these stages, a couple of things that we have to point out. For Erickson, he believes that each of the stages that he identifies and the ages that he attributes to the stages are part of a biological program. Right? That these 8 stages that he identifies, right, he calls it epigenetic. And the term epigenetic means set down biologically or in the genetic code. That there's a code, that there's like a biological ground plan. And so he believes that he has identified the stages that correspond to our own biological growth and development. What he does over here is he identifies the psychological issues that he now has come to understand that correspond to those particular stages. First stage, trust versus mistrust. Second stage, and again, you don't have to memorize all of these things, but a few things about them and about Erickson. He thinks, right, there's like a healthy resolution and an unhealthy resolution to each stage. If there is an unhealthy resolution in one of the stages, that predisposes us or sets up a kind of momentum that can move us, right, to unhealthy resolution of subsequent stages. Now, unlike Freud, who thought that once something traumatic happened to us, we were scarred for life. And again, it depends on the nature of the trauma. Erikson thinks that even if there is an unhealthy resolution in one or two places in life, that we can overcome it. Now, we might need professional help to overcome it, right? But greater awareness, healing relationships in later life, right, or therapy can help us to overcome some of the ill effects of developmental issues, right? But that tends to be what he thinks. If we don't overcome a particular issue, right? So if there is an unhealthy resolution, like let's say the individual comes out of the fourth stage with a sense of inferiority, what do you think might happen? See, for Erikson, as for other people like him, this can play out in our lives in various ways in adulthood. And it becomes like an unconscious tendency in us. Unconscious feelings of inadequacy that play out in us. Right? Where? The kinds of choices we make, the kinds of relationships we're likely to get involved with, the kinds of things that we see as possible for ourselves. It can set up a life, right? A particular path which our life starts to take, a trajectory for our lives. That's basically what he thinks. You'll see this again when we get to Freud in a much more dramatic way. Because Freud thinks that we live out what was set down in the early years. There is a tendency for that in Erikson, and there is a tendency for that in the real world, right? People do live out a lot of the things that were set down in the early years. Erikson thinks that in some way we will seek it out in adulthood, even in unconscious ways. That some of our deficiencies, some of our setbacks will show up again. That they'll come out in us in some way. He focuses on a couple of things. He talks extensively about adolescence and identity formation. Identity and identity formation, I mean, when Erikson was talking about it, it was relatively new when he first started talking about it in psychology. He maintains that during adolescence, this is the optimal time for us to begin developing a sense of self and a sense of our own identity. But we may not come out of adolescence with a solid sense of ourselves. We could come out of adolescence with a weak or damaged sense of self. That weak or damaged sense of self will set us up to make poor decisions. I'll tell you what he says. We're not going to have the time to talk about the ramifications of all of this. Erikson maintains that unless an individual has a true sense of identity, right, a solid sense of themselves, that true intimacy is not possible in life. He's not the only one to say this, by the way. What does that mean?
You have to know what you want in order to properly enjoy what your partner is trying to do.
That's very good, that's a pretty good assessment of it. The failure to completely understand who you are, right, or what you might want out of life, or what your life might stand for, or what your life's purpose is, or the ultimate meaning of your life. You know, failure to get to know oneself before one, right, as one makes choices that are significant in terms of relationships, career. These are things that will be lasting and dramatic. He talks about intimacy, right, and true intimacy only being possible when one develops an adequate sense of self. But what about adolescence? And what about what happens during adolescence? Adolescence can be a time of turbulence, can be a time of acting out. Why?
Hormones.
Why?
You're growing.
Is it just hormones? Why might adolescence be a time of turbulence, a time of acting out, and a time of rebelliousness?
Trying to discover who they are.
Trying to
and what
discover
their
who you
role is.
are, and at the same time, what?
What their role is.
Well, Erickson maintains that you have to separate from parents. You got to get out of the dependency. And in moving out of dependency and in declaring your own autonomy, right, separation, that separation may come with a price. Right? That it involves setting up boundaries. Here I am. I am not, right, you. Right? I don't have to look like you, dress like you, think like you, talk like you. Right? And so that separation, right, on the road to individuality and autonomy, Erickson sees this as a necessary and vital part of personality growth and development. Right? In addition to the physical changes that are taking place, there's also a psychological reason for it. He thinks that the way in which identity begins to crystallize in adolescence, right, is likely to stay with us in life. All developmental psychologists that talk about personality growth and maturation all talk about transitions in life. It's generally the transitions in life that give people the most problems, when people are moving from one life stage to another. And adolescence is really the first transition that we face, moving from childhood to adulthood. And as we move or transition from one life stage to another, lots of underlying things can be brought to the surface. The next time it's likely to happen is in middle adulthood. That's the next line, and when people are moving from young adulthood, right, to later adulthood. These are transitions that usually bring up unresolved issues or limitations in us. As stress usually brings out things, right? You know, in a stressful situation, in stressful situations tend to bring out what's underlying. You know, when you have a fight with your boyfriend or girlfriend, the fight starts about one little thing, but by the time the fight ends, it's probably about 10 things that either she's yelling at you for or you're yelling at her for. Right? What about this? What about this? What about this? Right? It's off the issue. So the stressful situation usually brings up what's not resolved between you two. Right? And stressful situations for the individual, right, like transitions, usually bring to the surface what's unresolved in an individual. And most developmental psychologists all talk about life transitions as bringing up, right, what people haven't dealt effectively with. Just like what you don't deal effectively with through effective communication and in the relationship is going to come out when people argue. Right? They bring up everything under the sun. he talks about integrity in later life. So he talks about generativity and he talks about integrity. And some of these concepts, right, they're mentioned in your book. By the time people get to later life, if individuals, Erickson maintains that some people go through life and they really don't take the time to understand why their life is important or what their life means, and so if they get to old age and they never grapple with a sense of what's important to them or why they have lived, or that these are individuals who in old age are likely to feel isolated and alienated from other people. Right? They don't understand why they lived. They don't understand what the purpose of their life was. They feel as though they got a series of bad breaks in life, that life treated them unfairly. And so they tend to approach old age with lots of angry feelings. Right? They don't feel like their life was complete or that their life was terribly successful. And those feelings usually lead people to kind of retract or withdraw, rather than to give to others or to contribute to the well-being of the community, to other people. So I don't want you to memorize these things, but remember Erickson, 8 stages, talks extensively about the concept of identity. A great deal hinges upon how the identity issue is resolved for Erickson. Ultimately, when we move into young adulthood, the types of choices that we make will spring directly from how we see ourselves. Suppose that you found out, right? Suppose that an individual found out that he or she had a terminal illness that was now going to limit their life. And their life was going to be, right? Their life was going to end in a relatively short period of time because there was no way out of the illness. There was no cure. Right? There was nothing that was possible. What do you think a person's first reaction would be to the threat? Denial. Anger is there, but usually, right, denial is one of the first reactions. It can't be. Can't be the case. Can't possibly. Huh?
It must be wrong.
It's got to be wrong. Right? It's got to be wrong. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a therapist, and Kubler-Ross, one of the things about Kubler-Ross is that she began working with people who were terminally ill. Right? There was no medical hope for these individuals for survival or to turn their illness around. And what happened with Kubler-Ross is that she began to notice a pattern in the way people reacted to the possibility of their own demise. And right, she begins to identify the reactions of individuals and, in a sense, begins to identify stages. Right? The first one, she said, was usually denial, like this can't be right. This can't possibly be right. Right? The second stage she talks about is anger. Number 3 is bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So she begins to identify, right, an individual's reaction to some news that they can't internalize. They just can't take it in. What else would this be describing?
Well, you mean what's the name of those things?
No. It's describing, right, a person's reaction to their own, right, limited life. Yeah, grieving, right? A process of grieving. As people grieve for themselves, if you, right, found out about the death of someone close to you, especially someone that you just saw this morning or last night, is it difficult to internalize? It's like, it can't possibly be. I just saw him. I just saw him, like, this morning. We had breakfast together. What do you mean he's dead? What do you mean? It can't be.
It's like when the infant doesn't accept that something exists when it's not in front of its face anymore.
Yeah, object permanence. Right? It's like we can't, news that is overwhelmingly tragic or traumatic for us, it's like our first reaction is usually disbelief. And denial is like a defense mechanism, really. It's like we can't take it in. It's too much. It's overwhelming. To anger. And the way in which people react, right, their feelings of anger, they can be angry at God, they can be angry at the medical profession, they can be angry at any number of things. The stage of bargaining, right? It's like people try to make some cosmic trade-off with the universe, right? I'll commit my life to this, I'll do that, I'll do, right? As if they can bargain it away. Depression. Anger and depression are usually two sides of the same thing. Very frequently, right? Do people generally move through the stages just like she identifies? Maybe. But it's not uncommon to see people go from depression back to anger, or depression back to denial. Right? People can vacillate, or from depression back to bargaining. Right? From bargaining, then to acceptance. Not everybody goes through the reactions to something that they're grieving for in exactly the same way. Grieving in response to loss of a loved one or loss of someone close to you. What else could this be grieving for?
The loss of an important thing or event or
Yeah, or
whatever.
people grieve the loss of a significant relationship in their life. Right? They go through stages of grieving. Right? So what Kubler-Ross identifies is really the process of grieving itself, which is actually quite good. I mean, the things that she identifies here are really quite good.
What's her name?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She's in the book. Right? Sometimes people get all the way to acceptance, and then they might regress. I worked with a young woman a few years ago. She was like 38 years old. 38 years old, her husband was 42, almost 43. Right? 2 kids, 11-year-old girl, 8-year-old boy. They went away on vacation. The guy had a massive heart attack and died within an hour. It was incredible. So here she is, 38 years old. Right? Left with 2 children. And, she goes through, guy is buried, there's a service, and she was actually a social worker. She worked, she was a social worker before she had kids. When she had kids, her husband had a very lucrative job. And so she primarily was a stay-at-home mom, taking care of kids. But she had a master's degree in social work. So her husband died, and looks like she's adjusting, looks like. Right? About a year after he died, she said she was at the mall one day, and all of a sudden, she said she felt overwhelmed, like, did this really happen? Did this happen? This couldn't have happened. This is not part of the life script. Somebody who's 42 years old shouldn't have a massive heart attack and just die. How does that happen? Couldn't have happened. Did I dream it? She said she thought she was going crazy. It's a grief reaction. People's reaction is grief. She said she had to leave the mall and go home. She couldn't figure out, right? She said she was like dumbfounded. Was this real or did I imagine it? Did I dream it? Is it possible? Did all this really happen to me? It can't. It can't. She had to go home. She looked through the whole house, she said. Looked through the house, looked through the closets, looking for verification as to whether it was real or not. She ultimately got to a place where, about 5 or 6 years after the death of her husband, where she began to work with Catholic charities, and she started running support groups and therapy for grieving individuals who lost a partner, men and women. Her way of, in a sense, giving back, because she had a degree in social work, so she could do therapy. She could do counseling work. So, not everybody goes through it, and you get through it and you're done with it. Right? People can grieve the loss of something that's very important to them, and go through stages, various stages of grieving, with lots of different and varied reactions.
Is it possible that somebody could skip one of the steps and
Yes.
never go through it?
Yes, never go through it. That's entirely possible.
And some people never actually complete the process.
That's correct. Some people do not complete the process of grieving. That is absolutely correct. Sometimes people can't grieve at the time because it's just too much for them to take in. And it may look like they're doing well. And then at some later point, something may trigger a reaction from that. Again, the reaction can be varied.
So people never accept, a lot of people in the depression stage.
That they what?
I said a lot of people don't go through acceptance at all, some people just stay in the depression stage.
Some people do. Some people can go through long grieving reactions and remain depressed for a considerable period of time. That is absolutely true. There are therapists who actually specialize in getting people over grief and loss, because it can be a very difficult thing to handle. Some individuals just don't cope very well with it. And one of the most difficult, it's difficult, loss of spouse, loss of partner. What else is very difficult to cope with?
Children.
Loss of children.
Their job.
Job loss can also be very significant and can be very significant, especially with someone's identity. And that was very true, much more true generally for men. Generally, women have more sources of identity than men did. Men only had one primary. Their identity was usually invested in their job and seeing themselves as providers. Right? As the society and as the culture is changing, some of that is changing. But women are generally ahead of men in terms of alternative sources of support. Men usually don't have good support systems when something happens. Women are better at that. Some male therapists have tried to deal with this, actually, and have written about it. But let me just mention a couple of things. And I only want to mention them briefly. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going over this. But on the outline sheet, there were a few things that I identified in terms of childhood problems. I just want to mention them only briefly. Learning disabilities. As I'm sure most of you realize, a learning disability or a learning disorder is not by any means an intelligence problem. It is actually a processing problem in the brain that we do not completely